Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the astrological forecast for November of 2020. Today is Monday, October 26, 2020, starting at 11:15 a.m. here in Denver, Colorado. And this is something like the 277th or 278th episode of the show. Kelly knows she's been counting since day one.
Since day one.
Joining me today is Kelly Surtees from kellysastrology.com. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Chris.
And also Austin Coppock from austincoppock.com. Hey, Austin.
Hey, Chris.
Welcome back to the show. So we've got a little bit to talk about. There's been a lot that has happened in the world over the course of the last month, and we are reaching the last stretch of this sort of culminating 2 months of 2020. So a lot to go over. Let's start off with just the animation this month of the astrology of November. All right, so our animation, as usual, is illustrated by Paula Bellomini and animated by Hugh Tran. The moon starts off in Taurus this month with the full moon conjunct Uranus in Taurus at the very end of October, but that energy kind of bleeds through into the very beginning of the month of November. Eventually, Mars, around mid-November, stations in Aries, stations direct, ending its retrograde cycle, and we get a new moon in Scorpio mid-month, I believe on the 15th. The Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, the third one, takes place this month, the third and final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. And then eventually, we get a full moon and lunar eclipse at the very end of the month on the 30th, which takes place in the sign of Gemini. So pretty snazzy animation this month. Here is the other calendar for the month that just shows the dates. So Mercury, of course, which has been retrograde for 3 months, stations direct on November 3rd, which just happens to be Election Day in the United States, presumably completely unrelated. Mercury will ingress into Scorpio and leave Libra on the 10th of the month. Then we get that third and final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction on the 12th, Mars stationing direct in Aries, ending its several-month retrograde phase on the 13th, new moon in Scorpio on the 15th. Venus goes into Scorpio on the 21st, and the Sun ingresses into Sagittarius on the same day. Neptune stations direct in Pisces on the 28th, and finally that lunar eclipse in Gemini on the 30th of November. So that is our basic overview of the forecast that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this episode. Where should we begin? I mean, we basically, since we start out the month of November with Election Day, do we jump right into the election, or what are the energies that we're coming into November with? Should we maybe talk a little bit about that full moon that we're coming in on in Taurus, or what?
We should, but I want to make one general point about the planets. If we just look at the visible planets, right? So no Uranus or Neptune or Pluto for the moment. As the month begins, every planet except for the sun and the moon is in a cardinal sign, right? And of the three modes, the cardinal, the movable signs are they're considered dynamic but also volatile. They are, cardinal is make shit happen energy, and for good and for evil and everything in between. And
was that Ptolemy that said that?
Yeah. Well, that's my translation. I'm working on a paraphrase
from the original Greek. Got it. That's good.
Yeah. But that's an unusual thing. We don't. It's very rare that we have so much cardinal all at the same time, or so much in any of the three modes. Right. And that's part of it's such a fundamental piece of the zodiac, right? Every zodiac sign is one of 4 elements in one of 3 modes. Like, that's all like first couple months of learning anything about astrology. But it still matters. And I've been referencing Dorotheus a lot in my year 2 class. And so I've been rereading that. And in elections, he places a huge emphasis on just the mode of the sign that's rising. And it just made me remember, like, oh yeah, that really does matter. Cardinal, fixed, and mutable are very different. Fixed is steady, potentially boring. And mutable is undecided, prone to change, may double back on itself, may do one thing and then another. Whereas cardinal is just starting, getting things moving. And so, it does seem like appropriate, right? What begins, right? Like this is so it begins, might be one of the many title suggestions for today. But anyway, just wanted to start with that. Lots of cardinal. And the moon will be in a cardinal sign exactly 1/3 of the time. So that's 6 out of 7 a lot of days.
Yeah, so lots of cardinal stuff going on. And especially because it happens at the very end of the month, even though technically it is in October, the previous month, it's relevant just mentioning that full moon in Taurus, which we talked about in the last forecast. But because we're recording this on the 26th, it's still something that has yet to come or that's coming up here and that will sort of take us into the following month. And I know that we talked a lot about that full moon being very closely conjunct Uranus and the feeling of excitement, of electricity, and a little bit of instability or surprises that are usually associated with Uranus, as well as this notion of things culminating or coming to some sort of completion with a full moon sort of energy at that time. How are you feeling about this full moon at this point, Kelly?
Yeah, look, it's definitely, I have mixed feelings because usually I love the full moon in Taurus. I like that, the moon is exalted in Taurus, so there can be a really grounding or anchoring or at least tactile and tangible quality. But of course, with Uranus there, Uranus and Taurus are kind of different archetypes. Uranus is change and instability and shaking things up like earthquakes. So I'm curious as to what kind of surprises are going to burst out from the ethers under that full moon. And then to keep in mind that full moon does take us through the full first 2 weeks of November, because it'll sort of be the lunation of influence until we come to the new moon in the middle of the month. And it's, to bounce off what Austin was saying, it's a real contrast because we have this lunation in a fixed sign, but we do have 5 planets, of the visible planets, excluding the lights, they are all in cardinal signs. So they're all trying to get things started, whereas the full moon in Taurus is kind of trying to do something a little different. So it'll be interesting to see kind of who wins with that.
Yeah. And for people...
Go ahead.
Just for people to think about where that falls in your chart and what house, and the potential for unexpected developments or potentially even disruptions for better or for worse in that sphere of your life.
Yeah, surprises. And are they welcome surprises or are they kind of those shocking, unexpected surprises?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have 2 thoughts on this. I think collectively, rather than as an individual transit, it is the last in the sequence of the October surprise configurations, right? Because we had lots of action with Uranus in October, and so
right.
and we get a big one on the very last day.
Was perfect.
Yeah, that worked out quite well.
That was our working title for last month's forecast, was October surprise due to the Mercury retrograde opposite Uranus, which we had 2 of, and then the full moon conjunct Uranus, which we haven't even somehow gotten to yet. But I think that's already worked out pretty well.
And so when I look at that, I kind of feel like I'm playing like a video game, like a dungeon crawler, and it's a big treasure chest that has a moon symbol on it. And there may be, when I open it, there may be an explosion, there may be treasure, there may be poison gas. There may be, a +3 sword. But it's like, what's in the box, right? Because we don't really have the full story on October until we find out what's in the box. Right.
Mm.
Right.
And so November, and so we don't know what's in the box, but we know that November begins right after the box opens. Right. And so this is the beginning of November, is opening yet another Pandora's box. Hopefully it's somebody else's container, but there've been enough of those this year.
Yeah, that's a really good point that we have to think about November as being a continuation and a culmination or completion of some cycles that began a while ago. So there's the Mercury retrograde period, which is a 3-week period that eventually culminates on November 3rd with Mercury stationing direct in late Libra, but that's something that began at the very least 3 weeks earlier in the middle part of October. I guess right on October 13th is when Mercury stationed retrograde in Scorpio. Then we also will see the culmination and the completion of the Mars retrograde period with Mars stationing direct in November on the 13th, but that was something that began at the very least way back on September 9th when Mars first stationed retrograde in Aries, but really has been something that's been coming for a while since I think late June, early July when Mars first ingressed into that sign.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We were discussing how to discuss November, and there's no way to discuss November without discussing what led into November. Because as is clear in the world, but also just from the astrology, November does not begin a whole new story, right? It's all of these stories that have been running and intensifying, especially, let's just say, since September. There's some things that are longer, but we're in an arc that really began in September. And one of those pieces is Mars, and another of those pieces is Mercury. And so to talk about where we are going, because these are retrograde planets, we literally have to talk about territory they've already been through and are going to do again.
Definitely. And then another one I will also be talking about is the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, the third Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which also completes this month, which, we didn't put a lot of emphasis on initially in the first one because we were so focused on other ones that were more pressing at the time that were happening simultaneously, like the Mars-Saturn conjunction that was happening in like March, April, and all the crazy pileup of Capricorn planets then. But then we started taking note of the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions much more closely later in the spring and in the early summer when we got the second one, because we noticed back then in one of those forecasts that for some reason they were starting to coincide with, at least in the United States, like the second wave of COVID tests and diagnoses and stuff. So we now are getting into the third wave, and we're seeing that potentially start to coincide again with the third and final Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. So here's a little diagram that was made by Kyle from Archetypal Explorer, from archetypalexplorer.com. And it just shows the 3 exact Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions, which the first one was in early April. The second exact one was at the very end of June, early July. And then the third and final one is going to culminate here around the middle of November. And when you plot that against the new COVID cases, daily diagnoses, you see the first 2 waves coincide pretty well with the first 2 conjunctions, and now we're sort of like on track to see a third wave potentially coincide with that in November, although we're still like a few weeks off. So it's actually a little bit unsettling looking at it from that perspective in terms of, how high does that third peak end up being?
Yeah, that's a nice match. Well, one of the things that I remember talking about with the first one and the second one is and we talked about this. I think we did better work earlier than you're remembering. We talked about the Jupiter-Pluto signature and how it shows up in the charts of virtually a shocking percentage of billionaires. Warren Buffett's got it. Bill Gates has it. Carlos Slim has it. It's something that shows up around like just epic money.
Yeah.
And the first one coincided with an utterly unprecedented, I don't know what you're going to call it, bailout, rescue, whatever package, almost $3 trillion. And I remember, and I want to take accountability for this, I thought we were going to get a second, some kind of package in the United States when the second one hit. And there was the discussion around that peaked at that time, but then it didn't happen. And so now it looks like
maybe that's because it was retrograde.
Right. That's what I was thinking, because it looks like there will be a something shortly after. There'll be a something around something aid, looting, whatever combination of those it is, package around the third conjunction, which is also direct. And so I'm interested in that, like the Jupiter-Pluto being the movement of huge amounts of money, right? Vast impersonal fortune numbers.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there was some movement to try to push through, get one going in October, but it seems like it's not happening before the election due to various political maneuverings and things like that. But perhaps we'll see one happening in November, coinciding with this third conjunction.
Right. And the bailout in 2008 was also right after a Jupiter-Pluto. It was right around a Jupiter-Pluto.
Okay.
So we have that tracking.
Yeah, so that's another major cycle that's coming to completion in some sense, or at least peaking this month. What are there any other sort of completion things that we're following through this month?
The only other one, I think they're the three major one, is that we do have the third and final Mercury-Uranus opposition aspect that we've been watching as it went into, we had first hit direct Mercury, second hit retro Mercury, and the third and final, which Mercury is now direct opposition to Uranus, will be around the 17th. So we've got... It's interesting how there's a number of things that have been like a sequence of 3 or 2 things that have been going on. Jupiter-Pluto since April, but some of the Mercury and Mars stuff, since September or October. And everything is just kind of coming to its conclusion point through November. Or it's like, here's the final piece, so now we have the clear full story this month.
Yeah, definitely. So that Mercury retrograde, there were a bunch of things. Do you guys notice anything majorly notable in terms of either the Mercury retrograde itself or the Mercury-Uranus opposition? I felt like there was more that ended up playing out pretty well, I noticed more like technical glitches and technological snafus taking place at different points with the Mercury retrograde opposing Uranus last month, or in October this month. Did you guys notice anything that stood out?
Yeah, in some ways, the configuration of Uranus enhanced a lot of what we think of as Mercury retrograde's core qualities. Like, Mercury retrogrades are disruptive. They are a change of pace or schedule. And so, whereas with a lot of, when you're analyzing Mercury configurations, and another planet is involved, a lot of times that will change the nature of what Mercury is doing, right? Is the postal person delivering bombs or cakes or bills? It very much depends on what's being delivered. But this configuration of Uranus just seemed to amplify the standard Mercury retro stuff. Like I had an extremely classic one. My phone simply stopped taking a charge the night that it's stationed. Nothing had happened. There was no violence to the phone. It just stopped working. And then the next day I was the next day I was supposed to do some banking, but I couldn't do that because I needed to confirm via text. And it was just the standard spiraling out or the sequencing of cascade is the right word, of like one little problem delays this other thing, and because this is delayed, this third thing is delayed. Like very classic.
Yeah, totally. Did you notice anything, Kelly, interesting?
I was just checking back in my calendar, and I had, because it was the second Mercury opposite Uranus aspect when Mercury was retrograde was just after the sun had been in its dark tunnel of dealing with Mars and Saturn. And I got so frustrated with not being able to find a Pilates instructor that speaks English that I could work with online that I just madly went Googling on the internet, and I just stroke of luck found somebody who's in the Central Euro time zone, which I didn't expect to happen. And I'm like, their website's got really great English. I wonder if they're a native English speaker or they've got, really strong English as a second language school, because I'm a native English speaker and I needed someone I could communicate with. And it turns out this person's actually Australian who's also living in Europe for a period of time. So I actually had a positive. I'd had a more difficult experience trying to find someone online a month or two before, and just it wasn't a good fit, and I'd lost motivation. And so it was one of those weird things where I got so frustrated by something that was bothering me that I just did it and second go round and was able to get a better result. So slightly more positive outcome there than your phone, Austin.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, I got a new phone, so that's exciting, and that's actually
that can be good.
So there's the positive technology side of Uranus, the like upgrade, and upgrade is disruptive.
Yes.
But for me, like I had to go into town to go to the store, and I've been meaning to go look at, there's a like a computer store in town. I've had the same tower desktop that for 5 years, and that was a hand-me-down from a friend. I've been meaning to get something nicer, and so the going into town to get the phone fixed hooked me back into the other thing that I was going to do. So at the end of this, I will probably have a much nicer machine. And there's that upgrade thing is, again, part of a lot of Mercury retrogrades, but then juiced further by Uranus. You had another example of this, Chris. Was it the Astro theme website?
No. Okay. Yeah. So that was one of the more positive ones, I thought, because you had a funny negative one of somebody who had like an unexpected Scorpio type Mercury retrograde story.
Oh well, yeah.
Involving,
I would not consider that an upgrade.
No, but it's funny.
Oh, it's a downgrade.
Mine is a funnier follow-up, a better follow-up, because it's like a positive version of like a Scorpio Mercury retrograde story. You want to do yours first?
Oh, well, I mean, I thought one of the sort of all-time best Mercury, Uranus, Scorpio, et cetera, was the situation with, I believe his name is Jeffrey Toobin. He's a journalist and author, very respected person who apparently accidentally exposed himself, and I don't mean his arms, during a company meeting because he didn't realize the Zoom camera was on. And this is a technology mishap, Mercury. We could say this was very strong miscommunication of the visual kind. And when we do the classic Mellothesiac diagram where signs map onto body regions, Scorpio rules the groinal expanse, right? And that was exactly the area that was exposed. And I was like, that's kind of one for the books. And also, this was a writer that this happened to, a journalist. If we're talking about what professions
a Mercury person
are ruled by Mercury, right? I believe this was abbreviated on Twitter as #ZoomDick. I'm not incorrect.
Yes. ZDI, I think.
That was something I needed to understand when I saw that trending on Twitter, and I was not sure. I wanted to know why it was trending that day. So that was more of an unfortunate Mercury-Uranus, Mercury retrograde in Scorpio thing. But on the flip side of that, one of the more positive ones is Peter from the website AstroSeek decided to go in and something.
Sorry, I got it wrong.
Yeah, astro.seek.com. It's one of the up and coming but really great birth chart generating services. He's been meaning to for a while add new non-binary, and finally did during the course of this Mercury retrograde, and again in Scorpio, integrate non-binary gender options, as well as new sort of pick your own pronoun options where you can add your own pronouns of they or them or what have you, basically whatever you want. And I thought that was a really interesting thing because a lot of people have been asking other websites like astro.com to add that for years, people that identify as non-binary, but astro.com has been really reticent to do so. So it's interesting seeing these other up and coming astrology websites like fill that gap, and the fact that it just happened to occur in a Mercury retrograde in Scorpio is an interesting like revision type symbolism.
Yeah. So that was a good one. Oh, there was also the it's nice to have options, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason not to provide different options or give people different options if they want to. I mean, I don't see why anybody would have a problem with that necessarily.
Yeah. Well, the world. There was also, very Mercury in Scorpio related, but different note. Apparently, and I wish I had the story in front of me, but apparently, a branch of the Canadian military did a test run of a psyop, where a bunch of people in an area were sent like warning messages about like all these crazy wolves that were in the forest, and then they had speakers playing wolf sounds in the forest, and then that got called out, and there was a like, hey, you're not supposed to do psyops on your own citizens. It's worth looking into. Like, here we're talking about the emotional quality of Mercury in Scorpio, and to a certain degree of Mercury in any in the sign of a malefic, but especially with Scorpio, we're looking at dealing with fear, right? Scorpio emotionally, there's a lot of like trust, fear management, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were literally trying to, it was an operation designed to create fear. And like, oh, there's something out in the dark that wants to get you. Can't you hear it? So I thought that was also, and it was an experiment, right? You've got that Uranus like test run thing. And then it was also an oops, the Mercury retrograde. It was, if if you are going to run psyops and your citizens don't get caught, I think that's probably, I would prefer not, but that's a big fuck up. That's a big oops. That's a classic Mercury retrograde oops that happened in October.
Yeah, and then of course there was a bunch of other October surprises politically, coinciding with the Mercury retrograde, which was already in like early degrees of Scorpio applying to Uranus by the beginning of the month, and we had first Trump announcing that he had been diagnosed with COVID after the first debate, which threw things into disarray about what was going to happen, if he was going to be able to keep campaigning, if the other debates would take place, and so on and so forth. Then the vice presidential debate took place, and that was the one that was scheduled the closest to, I think, one of the Mercury-Uranus oppositions. And the only surprising sort of annoying thing that came out of that was the fly incident, where this fly like sat on Mike Pence's head for like 2 minutes and became, for some reason, one of the largest talking points of the debate, or one of the more interesting or shocking things of the debate. But most people didn't notice that immediately after that debate, the debate commission announced that they were going to move the second presidential debate to Zoom. And as a result of that, Trump's campaign pulled out. And so the second presidential debate didn't take place and was unexpectedly canceled and disrupted, very close to that Mercury-Uranus opposition. So that ended up being one of the like surprising type disruptive things that happened during the Mercury retrograde in Scorpio opposite Uranus, was the canceling for one of the first times ever of one of the presidential debates right in the middle of the month.
Yeah. And I think it's important not to undersell in retrospect the amount of uncertainty that Trump contracting COVID brought to a number of stories. Like in retrospect now, we're like, oh, well, and it was, things are proceeding along a similar course as to before. But like, he's a 74-year-old man. That's danger zone, right? Like, and like it put a bunch of giant question marks on what might happen at the beginning of the month, right? It proved the value of going with October's surprise for the previous month's thing. And so like, yes, we know how that story ends now, but we didn't know how that story ended at the beginning of the month. And that story could have gone lots of other ways. So that was a big, chaos factor.
Yeah, well, and it coincided right with that story that all broke right at the beginning of the month, right on that full moon in Aries that was really heightening the Mars retrograde and all the Cardinal stuff going on. So it was right on one of the most sort of tense and pivotal times that happened right at the very beginning of the month. So
yeah, and so let's pull it to how this all lands and creates November, or unless you've got more stuff you want to go back over.
I'm ready to move on to November. I just wasn't sure if we should mention there was like one interesting anecdotal thing just about Trump's chart and what was happening with that and why that happened in his chart. Should we mention that now really quickly since it's relevant?
No, sure. Yeah, it's a nice little astro anecdote. I feel like those words could be combined. Astro. Yeah,
I was just thinking, how do you mash them together? How do we do a word?
They feel like they astrodote. Yes,
astrodote.
Thank you, K.D. Dayton. Astrodote.
Lovely.
So, let me show for those watching the video version, Donald Trump's birth chart with transits. So I'll go ahead and share that right here. And then back it up a month. So last month, of course, what was the day of the first debate? Was it like the 29th?
It was September 29th? Was the Mars-Saturn square and the Mars station? Yeah, the 29th.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a lovely Mars-Saturn square, and as everybody who, I don't know if you guys watched the first debate, it was a very tense, extremely unpleasant sort of debate between those two characters. Did you guys watch it?
I saw a summary clip, but not the whole thing.
I hate watched it.
Okay.
I wasn't like, I hope this is good. I had negative expectations. I think I put it on and played video games with the sound off and tried to drink myself to peace while it happened.
That's smart. That sounds pretty good. So, it was just a really tense debate. Trump was in full like Mars fashion with Mars conjunct the ascendant and Leo in the day chart, and he kept interrupting Biden, and it sort of threw off the entire debate structure of like a back and forth exchange, because then they just started having to interrupt each other and insult each other and stuff like that. So what was interesting though is we focused a lot in our forecasts talking about the end of September about not just the Mars-Saturn square that was completing around that time, but also that Saturn was stationing direct in Capricorn. So if you look at Trump's chart, Saturn stationing direct at 25 degree of Capricorn, using the Leo rising chart is Trump's 6th whole sign house, and it was stationing in opposition to his natal Venus at 25 degrees of Cancer, as well as his natal Saturn at 23 Cancer. So Trump is, interestingly, as we've mentioned a few times, in a third house perfection year, which is activating, his Neptune and his Jupiter in Libra in the third house natally, but it's also activating Venus as the ruler of the year, which is the ruler of not just his third house of siblings and communication, but also his 10th house of career. And since it's the perfection from the ascendant, it's representing also health and vitality for him to some extent this year as well. So that Saturn station in his 6th house of illness took on extra importance because it was stationing in opposition to the Lord of the year, and he must have contracted COVID sometime at the end of September around the time of that station. So it was
it's really classic, right? Yeah. Like it's a malefic visiting the 6th, which is the house of illness, hits the ruler of the year Venus. Also tightly opposes the natal Saturn, which is the natal ruler of the 6th. It's just, all this 6th house stuff, you get sick.
And then you see Mars.
I am, as I've been complaining to both of you privately, the ruler of my 6th is activated this year and just getting, I believe the shit kicked out of it is the right term.
The technical term.
Yeah, for the last 2 months, and I haven't had any acute incidents, but my general level of health has just been garbage. I was telling you, my ear randomly began bleeding. I usually have great health. Y'all know me. I usually have a lot of hit points, but it's been brutal. And that's just, when you're looking at health in your chart, when the ruler of the 6th gets a lot, when the ruler of the 6th gets lots of malefic attention, those are periods where you need to go the extra mile to take care of yourself. Because again, I haven't had an acute thing, but I've had, how should we say, systemic weakness, right? And it's come from different areas, like, oh, the smoke inhalation during September wasn't good. And then that like irritated my eustachian tube, which started bleeding into my ear. So I could only hear about 50% out of my left ear for 2 weeks. And then my stomach was really tender for the last 3 weeks or whatever. And these are just like, it's just like, under pressure, right? And it stands out for me because I have good health signifiers. So this is way out of the normal. It's been really easy to see.
Yeah. And your Time Lord this year is one of the slower moving planets. So it's sort of consistently in that state all year. Whereas if you're going into a 6th house year and your Time Lord is a quicker moving planet, you might see a little bit of fluctuation as that planet goes into and out of signs that it might, enjoy or dislike.
Yeah, well, it's not going anywhere.
No, yours isn't.
Yeah, but it's the natal ruler of the 6th, so 6th house perfection, so activating the potential for and the theme of grappling with the infirmity of the flesh, right?
Yeah.
And then the ruler of that in my natal chart has been getting all the attention from Mars and Saturn and Pluto. So it's just been a lot. There's a lot more on the health plate than there usually is. And a lot of times it's like you may not, I wasn't able to foresee exactly what issues I would contend with, but I knew the health significations of this basically 2 months ahead of time. I at least was not surprised.
Yes.
I didn't necessarily think it would start with smoke from forest fires, but that, it got there.
Yeah.
Listener in the audience, because we were recording this in front of a live audience, Leslie Koff interjects, though, however, in your 6th house perfection year. But Austin, you also got a kitty cat. So there's a very important mitigating factor as well for your 6th house perfection.
Well, your 6th house Lord is a benefic.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's in, natally it's in good shape. It's just
great.
2020 has not been kind to my chart, nor the chart, the thema mundi itself.
Yeah. So back to...
We got a little off topic there, Chris. Did you want to say more?
Long digression. Back to Trump's chart. The other thing that was really interesting, when the news broke that he was sick with COVID, he actually announced it, I think, first through Twitter. And everybody else was focused on... So it wasn't just, Saturn stationing in opposition to Venus, the Lord of the Year, but also Mars, when he got sick, was also because of the Mars-Saturn square, was squaring Venus at the same time. And Mars is the malefic that's contrary to the sect for him, so it's more problematic when it hits important planets by transit. So he was getting nailed with that natal Venus, both by Mars and Saturn. But what was interesting is when it was actually announced on Twitter, I glanced at it and I realized nobody had noted this, but Venus was right at 29 degrees of Leo that day when that announcement went out. So it was right on the supposed degree of his ascendant at 29 degrees of Leo, and Venus was activated as, again, the Time Lord for the year. So that was kind of interesting because there was this, basically, he's very focused on Twitter, and he has been for several years now, and that's like his main social media platform, for better or worse. But that tweet where he announced that he was sick got more likes on it than any tweet that he's ever put out. It got something like 2 million likes, which was huge, much higher than anything else. So huge amount of attention, and also from supporters and even from his Democratic challengers like Biden and stuff, issuing statements of sympathy and everything else. And I thought that was a really interesting manifestation of having something really bad happen, but then having something, at least for the native, that was subjectively positive at the same time.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting note, right? Because the event is the sickness. The announcement is the Mercury-Uranus opposition, right? And then the response is the Venus transiting the ascendant.
Right.
You can see each of them is playing a role. Obviously, the sickness itself is the root, but then we have what it does to the story, and then how people respond to that event publicly.
Yeah. So, and also potentially that he started receiving unique, highly advanced treatments like right away, which evidently did a good job because he was able to go back to campaigning not long after that. It's also worth mentioning because after the 2016 election, one of the points of reflection that I had was, were we using the correct chart? And there were two alternative risings, which were with that minute that he was born in, the ascendant switches over like 30 seconds into the minute into Virgo. So there was a legitimate question of, does he have 29 Leo rising or does he have 0 Virgo rising? And I think instances like this really drive home the point that the 29 Leo rising is probably correct. The alternative also was 17 Leo rising. But again, with Venus hitting the ascendant right on that day, with probably the most popular or at least visible tweet that he's ever done, there was something about that that's really striking and convincing to me.
Yeah, it's a nice, how should we say, it strengthens the case.
Yeah. There may still be, I think, Austin, you referred to the Virgo truthers. There may still be some debates out there that continue that are ongoing, which is fine, but it's, 1 point, let's just say 1 point in favor of the Leo rising.
Of the late Leo rising.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So, does that set up the context enough? Can we move into November? Is there anything else that leading into this that we haven't mentioned for the setup for, obviously, the very beginning of the month and Mercury stationing direct and one of the most important dates of the year?
No, I think it's Mercury time. Right?
Yeah, I think it needs some attention.
Yeah, so Mercury is pulled back into Libra, and is preparing to station direct as November begins. And while most of the retrograde and the lead up to the retrograde saw Mercury configured to Uranus, right, which is chaos, surprises, et cetera, Mercury is stationing direct in a very tight square configured to Saturn. Right. And Saturn has a very different attitude than Uranus does in terms of order versus chaos.
Yeah, definitely. So we can see this ingress or regress. Did anybody ever say that? Have we started officially calling it a regress when a planet makes a retrograde ingress into a sign? So that happened on.
I've used that for years. I imagine a bunch of people have. When you have to describe, when you do that sort of daily or monthly writing.
Right.
Yes.
All right.
As its
and
own
on
word.
the 20, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And you also get tired of using the other words. Retrogrades back into is not very elegant.
It's not eloquent. And if you've got a tight word count, you use up a lot of words to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Got to switch it up. So Mercury regressed into Libra around the 27th. At which point of October, it starts moving back into that square with Saturn. And by the time we start the month on November 1st, it is pretty much at that degree range that it's going to station at, closely square to Saturn, which is transiting at 26 degrees of Capricorn, while Mercury slows down and stations direct at late 25 degrees of Libra.
So, Kelly, you had some really nice thoughts about this when we were talking the other day.
Yeah, the Mercury Saturn, it is a very different vibe from Mercury Uranus. And the thing that it made me think of, I think Mercury Saturn, sort of official paperwork, important documents. And because Mercury's doing this very unusual thing where it's squaring Saturn twice, it's got an exact square to Saturn on November 1st. And then another exact square to Saturn on November 6th. That's Eastern time zone. At the same degrees, 26 Libra to 26 Capricorn. And it made me think of when I was filling out my permanent residency papers for Canada, where I had to submit all this documentation to prove that my relationship with my partner, who's now my husband, was real, a genuine relationship. So we had to get all these sort of documents. And then we had to fill out the form, and it was fill it out in black pen, not blue, and use block letters, and don't go outside the lines, and make sure you answer every question. There was this real sense of there's a structure or a procedure. we had to follow the rules. It wasn't a process that we could get creative in. We had to go through the process. And it feels, because I also tried to think about this first week of November. I know the election is a huge topic that, we're all kind of wanting answers for. But I also know that all of us have got our everyday lives going on within that week. And Mercury square Saturn with the station in the middle feels a lot like that sort of rote or, it's not necessarily routine, but the repetition of having to deal with data or forms or documents and not quite getting it right at the start of the week when Mercury's retrograde square Saturn, and having to come back to something at the end of the week to, dot the final I's or cross the T's. So it feels very, it has a little bit of a heavy feeling of like that worry, or concern. Have I done it right? Will it be okay? So a lot of heavy thinking and worry about, getting the procedures right, I think.
Yeah, it's so
what were you guys thinking of this? Yeah. Very slow, sort of very sluggish.
In sort of walking down the mental road that you pointed out, the theme of just slow, like Saturn is slow, and rules slowing down, delaying, right? Things taking longer. And this is when Mercury stations direct, yes, it's changing directions, but it's also slow. Mercury is barely moving. Right. And so this will look like slowdowns in a lot of areas. And it might be slow down because, there's a block in the road and you got to take a different route. Sort of the best case version of this is like, let's slow down and do it right this time.
Yes.
Right. But there's also just like, well, we did it right, but this thing happened and it's going to take forever. But just like slow. And I really liked what you said about filling out the paperwork, like doing it in triplicate. The idea that you have to work through a system, whatever the Saturn system labyrinth is. Mercury has to like slow down, work very carefully through, what might be a bureaucratic maze.
I actually have a nice little diagram that Kyle, again from Archetypal Explorer, made for us this month, which actually shows Mercury slowing down in October for the retrograde period and then moving backwards, which is illustrated in red here, and then eventually stationing direct on November 3rd. But it's just interesting in terms of those notions of like speed and directionality, but why the stations are so important in terms of being periods where it stops that movement forward and backwards and is just sort of like sitting in the same place for a time before it eventually slowly starts regaining speed.
And so there are the two exact hits between Mercury and Saturn, which we get during the first week, but that Mercury Saturn quality is going to continue until Mercury returns to Scorpio. Which brings us to a really interesting little slice of November, right? So what is it? Is it it's the 10th?
The 10th
in the American time zones? Yeah. So Mercury finally gets back into Scorpio and then starts applying to an opposition with Uranus again. So as far as the Mercury story, we have this like super slow, bureaucratic, dealing with obstacles, systematic sort of slowdown. But then we go back to the crazy disruptive, surprise, like what's in the box with Mercury Uranus on the 10th. And that's going to take us through the middle of the month. And we also have something else that's very important just a few days after the 10th. Did either of you note that the Mars's direct station is on Friday the 13th?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Definitely.
And the moon will be conjunct that Mercury and opposite Uranus on the day of Mars's direct station.
The Mars station.
And remember, of course, in Scorpio, Mercury is ruled by Mars.
Yes.
Yeah. There's this digging or like penetrative quality that we talked about Mercury and Scorpio last month. And I was trying to pay attention to, because I knew in mid-November, Mercury would come back to 0 degrees of Scorpio. So I was trying to pay attention to what happened when it first ingressed. And the main like major news story that I noticed that day, the first day that Mercury went into Scorpio back in like October, or actually it was at the very end of September. It was on September 27th was the New York Times dropped that major investigative piece about Trump's tax returns, where
Taxes.
somehow they found out his past taxes from the past decade or something, and found out that he'd only paid $750 one year in taxes. That report came out like literally as soon as Mercury ingressed into Scorpio around September 27th. So I sort of associated with that. If he has Leo rising, then that's his fourth house. And while we often focus on the fourth house as like the home and living situation, it's also the most invisible or the least visible part of the chart at the very bottom of the chart. So in ancient astrology, it was also associated with like hidden things and secrets and like buried treasure and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting if that becomes relevant again in some way, either perhaps not through the taxes thing, but something about hidden things or secrets that somehow becomes relevant again when Mercury re-ingresses and hits that degree at 0 degrees of Scorpio again.
Yeah, because we have this, this very different Mercury-Saturn quality for a couple weeks, but then we're back to basically the October Mercury, and the October Mercury is in Scorpio and opposite Uranus. And so my guess is there are going to be plot lines from October that come back around again in especially mid-November. Right, because it's not just Mercury's back in the same place, but it's Mars is stationing direct, and Mars is, Mercury is in a Mars ruled sign to some degree. Mercury is delivering Mars's things, right? We can say delivering information attack, right? Delivering attack by speech or by data or Mercury things, right? And so we should talk. One thing I wanted to say about the Mars. Are you ready to shift to Mars? I've got a bunch of good,
not yet, because
good Mars stuff.
You said a really good Mars thing, but it gets set up, and I remember in our pre-show chat, it gets set up first by the election and what happens on election day, and maybe we should stop and address that first and the different scenarios of possibilities, because then that's relevant to talking about what's happening later in the month when Mars stations direct. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
All right. So, obviously, one of the biggest things that happens this month that we already know and to look forward to, and we've already talked about Mercury stationing direct on November 3rd, and November 3rd this year, of course, happens to coincide with the U.S. presidential election, which that's the day everybody votes or has to have their votes in. And normally, under traditional circumstances, in most normal years, that's also later that night, typically, is when we would find out the outcome of the election and who will be president for the next 4 years, and whether Trump will get a second 4-year term in office or whether Biden will become president during the inauguration on January 20th, a few months later. So, however, because Mercury is stationing direct this year on election day, all the astrologers already for a long time now have been thinking back to the last time that happened, which, because Mercury moves in 20-year cycles, the 20-year synodic cycle of Mercury is 20 years. That's why Mercury in Zodiac releasing, for example, is assigned a 20-year period to Gemini and a 20-year period to Virgo. It's because of that Mercury synodic cycle, because it recurs perfectly every 20 years. So if you take this back 20 years, you get to November of 2000, which was the 2000 presidential election, when things were not finished on election day, but instead the vote was so even between the two candidates that it led to a bunch of legal battles, and everything was up in the air for about 6 weeks until it was finally decided in mid-December by the Supreme Court. So interestingly, just practically speaking, going into this election, because of the higher number of people voting by mail due to what's happening with COVID and due to all sorts of other stuff going on this year, a lot of people, just practically speaking, are trying to warn, a lot of reporters and poll watchers are trying to warn people that the election may not be decided on election night this year. So as astrologers, it's kind of interesting because astrologically, we already have a potential indication for that. And then practically speaking, a bunch of people are anticipating it as well. So we've got a few different scenarios about what might happen on November 3rd.
Well, and just to jump back to what Mercury is doing at that time, it's stationing direct, exactly square Saturn, almost exactly square Saturn. And like that, all that like slow down, like slow down, working through systems, do it over again, like maybe recounting.
Yeah, count and recount and then double check a count. Yeah.
Right. Like this stuff matters on an individual level, right? Mercury and Saturn aren't only commenting on what the Americans are doing, but it also comments on, what the American political system's doing. And so if we're looking for planets that look like a delayed result, that's a lot of, delay language from the sky.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we have a question then, just astrologically, about two things. Basically, A, do we see any indications or evidence of potential delays? And it seems like there are a couple of potential indications. I mean, it's always been a little weird that Mercury stationed direct in November of 2000 instead of like stationing retrograde. Like typically, you expect the first retrograde station, when Mercury is starting its retrograde period, usually coincides with major delays, and then sometimes things get resolved at the end of that 3 weeks and start moving forward again. So there's a little bit of a question there of is this indicating major delays, or is this indicate moving forward in resolution of some sort?
So I've been thinking about that, because that would be the sort of first go-to with astrology. Like, well,
Right.
It's the direct station. Like, we're moving towards clarity, right? I think this may be, because, we have a very strong precedent for this. I think this literally may be more a result of motion, right? Mercury's taking forever to go anywhere. It's the slowest Mercury gets. And if Mercury is the counter, right, is the one who counts things up, then we're talking about literally like taking forever to get the counting done. And so I think maybe it's more the speed and less the direction.
Right. The slowness and the idea of delays, and that being compounded by the square with Saturn. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, I think the compounding square, I like the point you made, Austin, around the delay, because in the context of an election, it's not just counting, but it's also votes coming in by mail that need to make sure they get there, and how long will that take? And so these are all Mercury things. Did you fill your ballot out correctly? How long is the mail going to take? Did it go in the right voting box? And then, queues to vote and things like that. So it feels very slow, and Mercury's a planet that really doesn't like being slow. He works best when he has some speed or some pace under him. And then when he finally sort of steps off his station degree, he's got to interact with Saturn. So then he's got to, prove everything. So I really think that whole first week of November is just sort of that hanging around, waiting on something to come through kind of vibe.
Yeah.
Right. So when we go ahead.
One of our questions is just if then, let's say hypothetically, there is a delay and the result is not known on election night for some reason. One of the questions that we started getting into, but we might want to get into more this month, is what are our potential dates for a final resolution then, if we can see that at all, or what are some potential turning point dates to look at over the course of the next month or two when things might be resolved. If we have a instance of this 20 years ago where it wasn't resolved until I think December 12th, when Bush versus Gore was decided by the Supreme Court and they stopped all the recounts, and that basically effectively gave the election to Bush. What are we looking at? What are the important astrological turning points that could be the important dates if there was a major delay in the results in this election? So to me,
you go, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, when I was looking at this, initially I was looking closely and I didn't want to discount some of the November dates because there are some crucial ones. There's, Mars stationing direct on the 13th as presumably a relatively important turning point. There is Mars or Mercury leaving its shadow period. Do you know the date on that, Kelly?
Putting me on the spot here. It's somewhere around the 19th or the 20th, I think. It's after the Mercury-Uranus opposition.
Yeah, I have it written down somewhere in here that I wanted to mention.
Sorry, I know I usually have that, don't I? I'll look it up while you keep talking.
Okay, so look it up. The other one at the end of the month is the lunar eclipse in Gemini, which is pretty notable once we get into eclipse season on the 30th of November. But the more I looked at this, the more I kept coming back to what you did, Austin, for some reason, was that eclipse, this major, major eclipse that takes place in Sagittarius on December 14th. But the issue with that is I don't know if that's because that things don't get resolved until then, in the same way that in the 2000 election, it wasn't until like December 12th that the Supreme Court resolved everything. Or I don't know if alternatively, the eclipse and everything keeps coming back to that because that is when the electors vote is supposed to be on December 14th. And that's when the final results of the election are always sort of formalized or finalized in some sense anyways on December 14th. And if that's not just a side effect from that taking place on that day.
Yeah, I think that these different configurations, Mercury finishing the retreading the same degrees of the retrograde for the third and final time, Mars stationing direct, and then the lunar eclipse at the end of the month. And worth noting, I believe we discussed this in the 2020 yearly, that lunar eclipse is particularly interesting in regard to a political contest like this, because both the sun and the moon will be conjoined royal stars, Aldebaran and Antares, both of which are associated very strongly with people in very powerful positions with huge amount of influence. And so it's very interesting. That was interesting to look at last year and be like, oh, good. There'll be an eclipse straddling two royal stars right after the election. I'm sure things will work out wonderfully. One thing I want to bring in, sort of as an advocate for Uranus here. Because Uranus gives surprises and disruptions, right? And we can know kind of when the box opens, but not necessarily what's in it. And because part of this story has to do with the Uranus oppositions and conjunctions, I feel like there is probably, in addition to the known difficulties that we'll be facing in figuring out a president, there's going to be at least one curveball that we don't see from here.
Yeah.
Right. There's something that's going to come sideways in addition to the expected difficulties.
Yeah. I mean, we still haven't been through like the full moon conjunct Uranus. There's further Mercury-Uranus oppositions. There's lots of other curveballs sort of set up for us between now and then.
Yeah. In some ways, I think the Saturn part, Saturn doesn't give surprises, right? And so this Mercury stationing square Saturn on election day, we're like, yep, these are all the Saturn reasons. These are the systems reasons why this will probably take longer. But then there's whatever the Uranian input is going to be. And we don't have to know that, but we don't have to know what it is to know that it's scheduled.
Yes. Yeah, I think on that point, Austin, the Mars station on the 13th and then the Mercury-Uranus opposition on the 17th, they both feel like dates where there's a little bit of that box opening kind of vibe. And, it is very hard to say exactly what they'll be, but it's like, let's wait to see what those dates bring. I don't think those dates will necessarily bring the answer to who wins the election, but
an important development though.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, this is a significant piece to that story. And that's the timeline that we want to keep an eye out for it. I also had my eye on that lunar eclipse, in addition to the points that you both made, is also that the ruler of that eclipse, Mercury, forms a sextile to Saturn on the same day. And Mercury-Saturn does feel just felt a little bit like, here's some important information, or here's maybe not the whole answer, but part of the answer or an important piece to that puzzle as well. So I think there are, a number of reasons why that eclipse on the 30th is definitely a date to watch.
That's interesting. So Mercury's squaring Saturn during
It'll
on the
be
election.
Yes, exactly. It's making one aspect to Saturn the first week of November, and then a, quote unquote, easier aspect to Saturn at the end of the month.
Yeah, and usually lunar eclipses are associated with like a culmination of events or completion in some sense, things coming to maturity that started earlier. So also of course, with the solar eclipse, though, so there's the lunar eclipse the end of November, and then there's the solar eclipse on the 14th. The other reasons that is notable is one, in the United States Sibley chart, it has Sagittarius rising. So we've been going back and forth all year, and I used to be, as we said in the last episode, much more skeptical about the Sibley chart, but I've been talked around. Austin, I know you're already a huge fan of the Sibley chart.
I think it's really useful.
Okay. So if that was hypothetically the chart, then the chart of the United States would have Sagittarius rising. So having an eclipse in Sagittarius, at that time, December 14th, would presumably mark something important happening at that time. Additionally, it's also important when Lisa Scheim and I did a little private thing for patrons a few weeks ago, looking at the charts of the candidates and looking at the election in general and just sort of doing a work session, sort of workshopping it. The other thing that came up, of course, is just that Biden also has Sagittarius rising, so the eclipse is going to take place in his first whole sign house pretty much no matter what. So there were different indications that we found for different candidates, like some of them were more in favor of Biden and Harris, and some of the indications seemed to lean more in favor of Trump and Pence. But the eclipse one, to me, was definitely one that was favoring Biden a bit more, just because in the past several elections, the primary presidential candidate that had eclipses falling in their first house or their 10th house tended to be the one that was winning at that time for different reasons. First with Obama in 2008, and then 2012, and then with Trump when the Great American Eclipse started taking place in his rising sign in Leo within a few months of his inauguration.
Yeah, and so I want to add an additional piece to this, and this is something that Freedom Cole, who's my teacher for Vedic astrology, pointed out to me. If we run the Vimshodari Dasha on the Sibley chart, the United States entered an 18-year Rahu period in 2016. Rahu being the north node of the moon, the eclipse point, and so if we were treating the United States sort of like a person, it's not a person, but it's, some of these rules still apply. We would just, your Time Lord was the dragon's head, then you would just assume that eclipses would be even more important than usual for moving things around. I was going to say forward. I'm not sure that's the direction we're going, but moving them.
Moving things, stirring things
Yes.
up at the very least.
Right. And the charts of the candidates are just all lit up like crazy by these Sag Gemini eclipses.
Yeah, because of course, Trump was born on a Sag Gemini eclipse as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lunar and Sag.
And he's a sun Rahu, close
when
close
you said
sun
that,
Rahu
I was
conjunction.
So the US goes into a Rahu period and elects a president who has Lord of the Ascendant conjunct Rahu in his natal chart, right? Like that's a pretty Rahu person.
And to be fair, Freedom called the result of the election in 2016 correctly. Not because it is what he desired, but he was looking at all this Rahu stuff. He's like, all right, I guess we're going, we're going to have Lord Rahu for a few years.
And that was partially based on looking at the upcoming eclipse that would take place the following summer and how it hit Trump's chart.
Yeah, it was really, there's a recording of him giving this talk in like 2015 somewhere on the internet, but he was just like looking at the big eclipse that was the big solar eclipse that just literally visually split the country down the middle, and then looking at the United States going into a Rahu period and looking at this Rahu guy and being like, well, I'm summarizing Freedom's process. I'm sure it wasn't just like, look at that. But like those were two of the major components.
Got it. Okay.
Which is interesting because we don't have a time chart for Pence, but out of Biden versus Harris has quite a strong Rahu placement with Rahu on Harris's ascendant.
Yeah, Rahu in the first.
Yeah.
So here's our chart with 24 Gemini rising and the North Node, also known as Rahu, at 24 degrees of Gemini.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. So obviously there's a lot going on here. It's like Lisa and I did a work session where we sat down for the first time because I wanted to put off looking at all of this, and also felt one, so much changes between, like, if you're looking at the presidential election at the start of the primary season or even the middle of it versus closer to the end. So sometimes it's better just to like wait until you have all of the data that you're going to have to work with and then look at it. But then also it's hard, even as astrologers, I think we all come to a realization of eventually, when you're super invested in like the outcome of something, it's hard to get distance from it. Even though we try, it's a little bit different than like sitting down and working with a client's chart, which is like somebody whose life you don't otherwise know until that day typically, and then you can look at it somewhat dispassionately. But if you're talking about like an event in your own country or that you're sort of wrapped up in or have some investment in the outcome, it becomes a little bit more tricky, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely feel too close to this to look at everything and come to a judgment in the way that I would be able to with similar data around things that I didn't, I have to live inside the result.
Yes.
And we're already living inside the period of history that brings us to this choice, et cetera, et cetera. There are mental health issues. There's a mental health biohazard warning with thinking too much about the present. Unfortunately, doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, but it is taxing.
Yeah, definitely. But nonetheless, we can look at some of the different charts and point out some of the things that we've noticed that are interesting, some of the different dates that seem to be turning points or seem to be where things will sort of spin on a top and go one way or another. Why don't we start breaking down some of the further weeks? We've talked a lot about the first week. Are there other things about the first week of November that we need to touch on? What were the two dates? Because it's been mentioned a few times. Is it the 1st and the 6th are the two dates for the exact Mercury-Saturn square?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And really the three big things in the first week are the two Mercury-Saturn squares and Mercury station direct. It's Mercury week.
Okay.
Yeah. And then back into Scorpio on the 10th.
On the 10th, yes.
And then exact opposite, third and final, exact opposition to Uranus on the 17th.
For Mercury.
And then fully done with the shadow on the 20th? Yeah.
19th, 20th. Yeah, I think Gray was saying that probably the 19th in the Pacific US time zone.
Paula Bellomini actually made me a nice little ephemeris for the last episode I did with Jessica Lanyadoo on Mercury retrograde, where this shows the retrograde dates, which are, roughly around the 13th, 14th of October through the 3rd of November. And then the shadow period extends all the way until about the 18th, 19th, once Mercury clears, 11 degrees of Scorpio?
11, yeah.
Okay. So because until that point, it's still just like retreading degrees that it has already moved through. And as a result of that, sometimes it's still wrapping up and bringing to completion issues that it threw up in the air earlier. So I definitely think that Mercury leaving its shadow date is important around the 19th.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
can we talk about Mars yet?
Yeah, we need to talk about the Jupiter-Pluto and the Mars station.
Yeah, Jupiter-Pluto so we talked a little bit about Jupiter-Pluto, but just to return and wrap that up, that's taking place on the 12th of November, the third exact hit of that. Are there any other, we've talked about the COVID spikes, and the reason people started paying attention to that, I just wanted to not reiterate, but we talked about that months ago in like the spring when we started noticing the second wave coinciding with it. But the reason that people started paying attention to that at one point earlier this year around the first wave was just because it turned out that back in the like 1918 flu, when that broke out, parts of the first and especially the second wave, which was much more deadly, coincided with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions back then. So for some reason, it's tying it in here again especially in the US and to a lesser extent in other countries in Europe and around the world, with a new wave that's sort of hitting worldwide. But is there anything else that we need to touch on with respect to Jupiter-Pluto?
Right. Bailout stuff.
The bailout stuff we mentioned.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
We already covered. The big movements of money, right? The bailout stuff is in the United States is a very visible part of it, but that Jupiter-Pluto corresponds to vast hidden reserves of wealth moving around.
Yeah,
movements upwards, but also downwards. I mean, one of the things we were talking about in the pre-show chat is how just completely divorced it seems like it's become, being able to talk about what's happening with like the economy or worldwide economies right now versus what's happening, like, for example, in the US with the stock market. And the stock market's still continuing to do well, but then these reports coming out about millions of people having lost their jobs over the course of the year due to what's happening with the virus and the ripple effects that's happening through the economy. I wonder if that's not, Jupiter-Pluto could perhaps be major upward movement, but also major downward movement.
I think it's really creating extremes that, people that were in kind of like that sort of week to week, just getting by, if you were in slightly more stretched financial circumstances, it's sort of become more difficult. And if you were one of those extremely wealthy people at the start of this, you may have gotten even wealthier in this time frame. It sort of exaggerated the extremes between, the haves and the have-nots, if you like.
The K-shaped recovery is a nice abbreviation for that.
We did talk about that in a previous episode, didn't we? Yeah. I think that's definitely part of it. And the other thing I'm wondering a little bit about Jupiter-Pluto is government control. I'm just thinking, and this is, I'm a little Eurocentric here because I'm thinking about when we had some of our more strict lockdowns. April for sure, when we had the first Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And as we're coming into this second Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, there are more parts of Europe that are going into more sort of rigid lockdowns at the moment as well. So I wonder a little bit about that sort of increase, whether it's, temporarily of government control or restraint, and then, potentially what might be going on behind closed doors as well.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because that just reminded me of the thing that I was really focused on and researching a lot for a few months there in the spring, which was the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions and the proliferation of, quote unquote, for lack of a better phrase, conspiracy theories. And I bet you no matter what happens on November 3rd in the US, there's going to be like either side or both sides are going to have an explosion of like major conspiracy theories and different theories and observations or speculations about what happened and about, underhandedness or whether the election, for example, in the US was valid, or if there's this huge explosion of COVID that's taking place right now. And if we get a third wave or a second wave that peaks both in the US as well as in Europe or around the world, and additional lockdowns and clampdowns, then one of the results of that is going to be a proliferation of like conspiracy theories about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether it's like a result of government overreach or manipulation or what have you.
Yeah, there's I think that's a good point about the stories, because in many ways we're all kind of desperate to know what the real story is.
What is the truth,
right? And how it ends.
Yes.
Yeah, we're like, what's good? Like that, and that in a sense, everybody wakes up at least every other day, looks out at 2020. It's like, so what's going on? There's so many things going on, so many things that are intersecting, some things that are separate, some things that are connected, but in a way you can't see. And human beings need a frame in order to be effective. Like, okay, this is the world. And then this is going to be how I'm going to approach the world, right? It's like playing a video game where the entire level and all of the enemies are invisible and you're just wandering around and taking damage. And I guess I can move here, but then I can't move here. It's like not being able to see the map. And so there's, I think, a very reasonable desperation to find a story that maps onto events that allows you to say, okay, here's the terrain, here's how, oh, it's muddy out, right? I'm going to put on knobby tires, right? Oh, it's not
Yes.
muddy. That's actually a different substance, which I thought was mud when I was feeling it. But now that I can see it, I know that it's, whatever. And so, yeah, and that intersects with a lot of things. But yeah, and one thing that comes to, or one more piece of the astrology that pings for me, is we've got the Jupiter-Pluto, right? And Jupiter is the ruler of Neptune and Pisces, and no one can spin a yarn like Neptune.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, Pluto, one of the basic significations of Pluto going all the way back to the 1st and 2nd century was truth and the idea of truth. And Pluto, adding Pluto to that just like intensifies it. So there's like this deep seated, like penetrated need to find out what the truth is and to like uncover the truth. And sometimes that can lead you in different directions or into different hidden corners of like the internet, trying to seek that. And sometimes you might find it and other times you might not. You might get caught up in something else, but who knows? Everybody's going into different like corners of things in order to find the truth this year and sort of grasping at it with greater or lesser degrees of success.
Yeah, I think there's that sense of going down research rabbit holes, and there's also a very basic human desire, I think, to go back to some of what you were saying, Austin, to feel like you have a sense of control over what's going on around you. And in varying ways, we've all lost things that we thought we were in control of or in charge of this year. We thought whether it was an illusion or it was real, we had a psychological sense of being able to be in charge of something. And this Jupiter-Pluto brings up, I think, some of the fear that goes with not having a sense of agency or control in kind of a collective, maybe shared sense, just to add that other dimension.
Yeah, there's the effect on the psyche, but there's also just a game planning thing, right? Like if you know what's coming up, then you can game plan for it.
Totally,
even
you
if
can
it's
strategize.
Very difficult, right? Whereas like you can't strategize with a void of data, like without a map. Like what, if someone says, "Oh, you're going on a trip," you're like, "Oh, okay, great. Is it going to be hot? I'll pack shorts. Is it going to be cold? I'll pack a coat." And they're like, "Oh, you're just going on a trip."
Yeah.
But is it going to be hot or cold?
It's a packing nightmare. Do I need my winter coat and my boots, or do I need my swimsuit?
Am I going to the desert?
Yeah.
Do I need water to survive? Will they feed me on the trip, or do I need to pack, I don't know, beef jerky? And then that of course connects directly to what you're saying about like there's a certain panic or let's just call it anxiety,
I think,
not knowing what to pack, because we definitely know we're on a trip. Right, things are moving, but the destination is significantly unclear. There are things about the destination, but in many cases it's not enough information to accurately game plan. And so there's the need to get the map so we can game plan better.
Yeah. So let's get on to and let's talk about your favorite topic, Austin, which is Mars stationing direct in this, what is it, the third week of, actually it's only the second week, late second week.
Friday the 13th.
Yes.
Okay. So around November 13th and November 14th, we have Mars stationing direct at 15 degrees of Aries. And this is actually also pretty close, just a couple days away from the new moon, which takes place in Scorpio.
Yeah.
Ruled by Mars.
Ruled by Mars. With Mercury back in Scorpio, also ruled by Mars. So Mars stationing direct, remember that was one of the main things that really focused on, especially in the third quarter of the year, was the Mars retrograde that was going to start in September. And the lead into that, began all the way back in, late June, when Mars moved into Aries on the 27th of June and started the buildup for that, just because it would then be moving through that sign for like the next 6 or 7 months for the entirety of the second half of the year. And it's interesting now that we're getting to not the complete end of that, but the end of that act with Mars stationing direct at 15 Aries here right in the middle of November.
Yeah. So I have several things to say about this. Before I say any of them, I want to give a martial arts example of Mars retrograde in Aries for anybody who follows. No, this is a completely relevant. It's not.
Okay.
It's a
it's
relevant,
not an irrelevant martial arts example like usual.
So, on Saturday, 2 days ago, Khabib Nurmagomedov, who is a Dagestani mixed martial arts champion and a huge celebrity around the world, especially in the Muslim and Russian speaking world, completed his epic run of 29-0, defeating Justin Gaethje, who everyone thought was the biggest threat ever, very quickly and handily. Now, why I bring this up is that, and then he announced his retirement with a perfect record. Khabib is Mars retrograde in Aries, and there's only been one of those since he was born. Like, this is that one. Mars doesn't go retrograde in Aries very often. So
no.
for the people born basically second half of 1988, this is their first true Mars return, right? It took 32 years.
Interesting.
And so we have the literal completion of an epic Mars story. Like, this person, Dagestan is rough, right? You don't expect to be a world famous millionaire if you're most people in Dagestan. Most in the richest countries in the world, that's not even necessarily an expectation. But Khabib literally wrestled his way to the top. And we have this perfect completion of retirement with an unblemished record for this Mars retrograde in Aries native, while Mars is retrograde in Aries, right? So I think Khabib gets to be the avatar of Mars retrograde in Aries. And what was really interesting is his previous sort of biggest fight ever, I believe it was the highest selling pay-per-view ever for mixed martial arts, was against Conor McGregor, who's also Mars in Aries from 1988. But it's direct and before the retrograde. And I thought maybe destiny might call them together again to fight during this period. I was incorrect. He ended up fighting Justin Gaethje. I looked at Justin Gaethje's chart. Oh, guess what? He's in 1988 with Mars in Aries, but it's direct after the retrograde. And so this is like the story of this one Mars cycle in 1988 playing out again, in front of millions of people, and bringing a whole chapter of life to closure. I thought that was really neat. And it was interesting it was beautiful, it was epic, and it was also sad because Khabib's father, who had trained him since he was a little kid, had died over the summer. And he literally said, I'm going to stop fighting. I promised my mother, I'm done. And we talk about Mars retrograde, like putting down, he literally puts down the gloves. And I believe it was Debbie Stapleton who pointed out the poetry of this to me yesterday, like the putting down the gloves, deciding, because a big part of Mars stations, direct and retrograde, is opening up this question of when to fight and when not to fight, right? And so he completed, this Mars retrograde in Aries to Mars retrograde in Aries 32-year thing and says, I'm done. I'm putting down the gloves. So pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Love it.
Do either of you have any good anecdotes, or did you see anybody that had Mars station or go retrograde in that whole sign house and had it match with some topic in that house in some significant or compelling way?
I mean, it's definitely been coming up in client consults, but I don't know that I can share those stories publicly.
I've mostly, so for us and for a lot of people on the West Coast, Mars's station retrograde is when everything caught fire. It was when there was the dry conditions with the crazy wind at the same time, that lethal combination of dryness, wind, and heat. And so literally we just stepped outside the door and saw everything was on fire. Like we could see fires on the hills from the house. And so that was the beginning of the Mars thing. So it's interesting for me. that put pressure on a health indicator in my chart. And so that smoke inhalation contributed to me, complaining about, not feeling too good and my organs being in a wretched state, which I did earlier.
Oh, of course. I didn't even think about that for you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I had some various things that happened, but I'm still waiting to see how they play out in the rest of this, especially when Mars station's direct. So I'll have to put
I look forward to your report.
Yeah, I'll have to report back after this month is over, and we'll see, especially once I switch into my new perfection year on November 1st and get out of this wretched 12th house perfection year that I've been in for 12 months now, successfully having survived it just barely. All right.
We forgot to begin the month with the most important thing.
Of course.
My solar
Happy
return.
birthday to Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, luckily, I'm going to bake that Mercury-Saturn square from the beginning of the month into my solar return chart on November 1st. So that's exciting. But at least I'm going to be in a first house perfection year, and I will take that over a 12th house perfection year.
That is a wonderful change.
Yeah.
We welcome you back to the world.
Thank you. I will reemerge like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon state, which I've been in for the past 12 months of being in my bedroom sick and recording podcasts all year, and we'll see how the next 12 years go. All right, so Mars is stationing direct. There's going to be forward movement. Austin, in our pre-show chat, I know you mentioned, and I think this is a good speculation, that's going to be Mars stationing could be really tense, and there could be some in terms of the election, and if there's any remaining things left over from that being stirred up into, anger or other similar Mars significations at that time.
Yeah. I think that's when whatever the fight is actually becomes clear and actually gets hotter. Could be wrong about that, but generally speaking, it's not that Mars is angry when it's retrograde and peaceful when it's direct. Like Mars direct is equally angry in some ways more. It's a matter of motion. You see the conflict will get clarified by the direct station, but sometimes the conflict, like that clarification, looks like, oh, we weren't sure how we were going to put you on the schedule, but it looks like you're definitely fighting this person on Saturday night. You're the third fight on the card. You're definitely going to fight. Here's the fight. Right. And that's not, there's a clarity about that, but that doesn't mean that it is peaceful. In many ways, it's like, oh, and on a personal level, oh, this is my fight. This is what I'm willing to struggle against and for, right? Because Mars, people talk about, how much fight does the person have in them? They don't have much fight left in them, right? Like to a certain degree, Mars is your reserves of fight and what that is dedicated to, right? And so there's there's often a clarification and a greater certainty about what you're going to use your fight for, right? It might be, it could be anything, but it's about forward movement. It's not about a lapse into peacefulness.
Yeah, whereas sometimes I could see that in some of the instances I noticed when Mars was stationing retrograde back in September of a potential conflict that then was removed or sidestepped or kind of put off temporarily, but which would come back later on, probably when Mars stations direct. So I could see how that might work out in different scenarios.
So here's a super depressing quick anecdote. It's not depressing. It's more ominous than it need be. But it's good and it comes to mind. So the German invasion of Poland was delayed during a Mars retrograde, and because everything kept getting fucked up. And then when Mars went direct, the invasion happened. Right. So that wasn't a good thing. In strictly military terms, if you were in that military, it's like, oh, things are finally going in, the direction that we intended. But that's not a peaceful result, but it's a certain result where there was uncertainty during the retrograde.
Yeah. So simply a delay in the conflict conflict is delayed during the retrograde or the station, but then
Mm-hmm.
the delays are removed and conflict is engaged when it goes direct.
Right. Like there's a real clarity there, right? In the, the English are like, oh, what are the Germans doing there? Are they going to invade? Are they not going to invade? Is this it's like, oh no, Mars direct. It's clear what the conflict is.
Yeah, I think the clarity is important. And then the other point that I think about Mars in November is that the station direct, obviously, we're all looking forward to Mars not being retrograde anymore. But in terms of pace and movement or progress, Mars actually is only sitting on 2 degrees through the whole month of November. It kind of comes in from 16, stations at 15. It's hanging out at 15 degrees for a couple of weeks, and then it just inches towards 16 degrees again by the end of the month. So Mars is, the way that I've conceptualized this is, it's not that Mars starts running again out of the, station direct. It's more like a pivot in place that might have a step forward, if you like. And that conceptual framework might be appropriate, so we don't expect too much right after the station direct date.
It's a forward march moment.
Yeah. Like the command is given, but it takes a little while for the troops to maybe move. Well,
yeah, it doesn't mean you've arrived at the battlefield, but there's forward march, and then the movement starts in the direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really going to depend on, for people individually, if they have any planets at 15 degrees of the signs, especially the cardinal signs, because Mars will be on that degree of 15 degrees all month. And also if you have a day chart or a night chart, a night chart, people might experience that if that degree is sensitive for you, as that idea that you guys are talking about of a forward march and of a change, that just something that prompts you to start moving again in that area of your life or with respect to that topic that it's hitting in your chart. But maybe people with day charts, or if that's a little bit more sensitive of a spot for you, might be felt more like an irritant or an irritation. We were talking last month, I think, about Mars as the spicy ghost pepper or something like that.
Yes.
That is, burning or irritating. And sometimes that can force you to do something or make a change, but it's doing that as a result of just getting away from that irritant or that pain or that sharp sort of pain that occurs during that time.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking back at how a person experiences Mars retrograde periods. They're my least favorite, just in terms of my energy levels and my mood, my productivity. I was born with Mars on the other side of the sky, with Mars and the Sun sharing a sign. So I was born in literally the opposite phase from the retrograde, which is, I think, part of why I dislike, or I vibe poorly with the Mars retrograde periods. But I, and certainly a lot of people who like a sort of normal Mars, right? That marches forward, that gives you a reason to endure pain, a reason to struggle, fills your gas tank up with a willingness to, fight to carve out your little life. I love Mars direct. I'm super looking forward to it. That's not universal, but that's a chunk of us are going to just feel better, be like, okay, I know what I'm doing. And it doesn't mean that it's fun, or it doesn't mean that it's pleasurable in a Venus way, but it means that it's meaningful. Right. When Mars is happy, we have a reason to endure suffering, because we're trying to get something done. And of course, it's not always going to feel good. But if we're certain in our course, that gives us the ability to endure or shrug off pain or unpleasantness. And so I like that Mars direct certainty personally.
For sure. Forward movement. All right. So are there any other things especially talking about the third week of November, that we need to touch on? We have that new moon that's taking place in Scorpio. It looks like at about, 23 degrees?
23 Scorpio on the 15th, I think.
Okay.
Maybe the 14th Pacific time zone.
So at that point, we have starting a new lunar cycle, starting a new lunar month, laying the foundation for the next 30 days.
And in the context of the forward march analogy with Mars retro, it is interesting that this new moon is ruled by that Mars, which has just stationed direct. So it's sort of this, Mars station direct is the forward march signature, as we've been talking about. And then that new moon in Scorpio is sort of a bit of a let's focus on the next 30 days or the next 4 weeks. So it's this real interesting sort of reiteration of that theme of, right, what are we doing for the next month?
Right. Yeah, so laying the foundations for the next month. There's not really any close configurations to like the degree of the lunation in the way that we've had in previous months. It doesn't look like there's a nice, at least in terms of hard aspects, but there is a nice sextile that's very, very close from Jupiter.
Yeah.
So that's pretty positive and optimistic. More so than like, let's say our, new moon, that was in Libra conjunct Saturn and like squaring Mars last month.
It's definitely nicer to have a benefic, throw you a bone, I guess.
I guess it's it's still I think the from a distance it's just gonna kind of look like Mars. Like it's right after the station. It's the sun and moon, meeting up in one of Mars's places. Mercury's back in Mars's place. Mars just stationed. I think it's just like there are going to be other pieces of it, but I think it's just going to look like Mars.
Yeah, lots of Mars.
From 30,000 feet, it'll look like Mars.
Let's see. So what else is going on?
Yeah, which will feel a little bit like taking action, maybe clarifying a choice, moving forward on a decision, that kind of thing, which I think will be welcome.
Right. So let's see other things in this chart. Venus is at 22 Libra. It's exactly square Pluto and applying to a square with Jupiter and Saturn. Mercury is applying to that third and final opposition with Uranus pretty closely. It's only 3 degrees away. So those are some of the other signatures we have in this chart for the new moon in Scorpio. So, unexpected disruptions with the communication and still some anxiety and up in the air and maybe technological snafus with the Mercury-Uranus opposition and some issues with like control or manipulation with the Venus-Pluto thing. But Venus-Jupiter is a little bit more optimistic, I think.
Yeah, there's something really interesting if you pair back what Venus is doing to sort of like traditional planets. She'll oppose Mars early in the month, and then she moves to square Jupiter. And the Venus-Jupiter square happens around the 16th. So that to me was just an interesting signature of like Venus engaging with a malefic and then moving towards a benefic. Now, it's not a benefic, Jupiter's not in great condition, but just that shift of talking to Mars and then talking to Jupiter. I'm kind of intrigued about what that might bring forward, whether there's something a little bit nice just on a passing, personal level that we might get out of that Venus-Jupiter interaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's been nice. Or what's nice, it's been a major shift from previous months, from the past few months, once Mars and Jupiter completed their last square, because it switched them up. Because previously, all the planets that ingressed into cardinal signs were applying to Jupiter all month. And then once they completed that square at some point, like halfway through, then they were applying to Mars and Saturn. But here, most of this month, we have a switch where they all have to get through Mars, which is stationing first, and the more difficult configuration, then they start applying to Jupiter.
Yeah, it's just a little change in the connections.
Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. We have all the benefics, both traditional benefics and both traditional malefics, kind of all in a T-square pile.
Right. All right. So moving on after that in terms of the third week.
To the ingresses.
The ingress is at the end of the week. Okay. So the two main ones happen on the same day, pretty close to each other. It is the Sun's ingress from Scorpio into Sagittarius, which takes place on the 21st. And then there is Venus's ingress into Scorpio around the same time, also taking place on the 21st.
Yeah,
So,
that's quite a mood shift. I can't remember. I think Venus technically goes first, doesn't she? And then the sun follows a few hours later.
yeah.
Looks like it.
So in terms of, just to very briefly mention some of the, oh no, this is irrelevant now. Hang on. I'll just strike that from the record.
Was it from the previous week or what?
Yeah, and it was more just I was going to make a brief political comment, but Biden's already had his birthday by now.
When is that? Because that's
the
actually
20th. Biden's birthday is the 20th of November, I think. Yeah, so he'll change Time Lords at that point from Venus to Mercury. Trump will continue to have Venus as his Time Lord. So the dignity change of Venus is quite interesting, obviously going from a place of sign-based strength to a place of sign-based weakness. So that may be interesting in the political story to a certain extent, but from an experiential, like a day-to-day personal piece, there's a real sense of wanting to get into the depths of things. That Venus in Scorpio will be ruled by Mars now direct in Aries. And there's a little bit more of maybe a sharpness or a specificity that I think might come into that sort of interpersonal relationship space with Venus in Scorpio and ruler Mars in Aries.
Yeah, and you mentioning Biden's birthday here was important actually because it's all tied in with attempting to figure out what's going to happen with the election. And that's one of the interesting pieces is that's then a perfection repetition, where if you go all the way back to the start of his political career, he was 29 years old he's in a sixth house perfection year now and will be on election day. And so one of the things that you do with annual perfections is you, if you want to know what a year is going to be like in a person's life that they're going into, then you just take it back in 12-year increments to see what happened 12 years before and then 12 years before, because the perfections always repeat every 12 years. And some of the symbolism then tends to repeat in the person's life. So if you take that all the way back, you actually get back to when Biden was 29 years old and he won his first political election, basically, when he was 29 in a sixth house perfection year. But then a few weeks later, he switched over right after that into his seventh house perfection year, activating that Saturn and Uranus placement on the descendant in the seventh house. And it was shortly after that his wife and children were involved in a car accident, and his wife and I think daughter passed away. Mm-hmm. So that then he was going to drop out of politics, but I guess some other politicians and friends convinced him to stick with it, and that then he ended up getting into office and starting his political career in that context. So that's an interesting repetition in terms of what that means for this election. Do you guys use perfection repetitions pretty regularly in your own practice?
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm nerding out on this a little bit because I love the timing. So November 72, Biden's in a sixth house perfection, ruled by Venus, and Venus is in Libra in 1972. Fast forward to 2020, he's in a sixth house perfection. Venus is his time lord. And on election day, Venus will be in Libra again. The time lord is sort of back in the same place around that same time of year, which wouldn't always be the case. Given that
that's interesting.
The time lord is in a place of strength by sign. It's just an interesting thing I just noticed.
Does that end up being a year divisible by 8? Because we were talking about the Mercury 20-year cycle earlier, and Venus has an eight-year cycle. So sometimes in 8-year increments, Venus will line up and be in the same spot of the zodiac roughly on the same day of the year.
That makes complete sense, actually.
Anyway, but perfections are interesting like that because you can see repetitions in a person's life. You have to be careful because when we did that last time 4 years ago with Hillary's perfections, which we don't have a strongly timed chart for, which may have thrown things off, she kept hitting really crucial turning points in her career politically every 12 years, but sometimes they were major jumps upward and sometimes they were major jumps downward. So there was a question of which one was it going to be that time, and it ended up obviously being the downward jump. All right, so back to the transits.
We had Venus coming into Scorpio and the Sun moving into Sag.
Right. And what's interesting about Venus, like one, that's just, as Kelly pointed out, just a difference in sign-based strength and also quality. Well, Venus is in Libra. I get the impression of like offering the olive branch probably won't be taken with Mars on a macro level, with Mars doing what it's doing. But that doesn't mean that's not true on a more individual level. Venus is at least going to try to bring some harmony and accord while in Libra. But in Scorpio, where Venus is technically in detriment, in a Mars ruled sign, Venus is a lot of times more interested in, instead of, wouldn't it be nice if we did this, ate this, had this, like desiring a positive. In Scorpio, I tend to see Venus being very aware of what it doesn't want. That's gross. Right. And that's its own sort of mapping of desire and preference, right? Is knowing for certain what you don't want. But as a general, as sort of a changed ingredient in the planet soup, it's less civil. It's less civil. It's more willing to fight. It's Mars ruled, right?
Yeah, one sometimes saying there's a rearrangement of the sentence you just said as well, which is that sometimes Venus in Scorpio likes the things that others don't like. And that's totally one of the things that becomes distinctive about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we also have Venus is then going to do an opposition with Uranus.
Yes.
Right? Just like the sun did, just like the full moon was on, just like Mercury did 3 of. So, it's one interesting thing that you continually rediscover when you're like, Uranus is in Taurus now. And you're like, right. And you think of it in terms of that place, but it also means every time something's in Scorpio, it's going to oppose Uranus, right? It changes more than just that piece of the year. It changes the other pieces of the year as well. Scorpio time becomes Uranus time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is not the technological and communication disruptions that we were talking about with Mercury-Uranus opposition, which is well on its way to being completely over at this point, with Mercury moving into the last decan of Scorpio, or moving through the last decan of Scorpio. But this is an exact Venus-Uranus opposition, and sometimes the disruptions in unity, or disruptions in relationships, or in ways of attraction that Venus can represent when it hits those hard aspects with Uranus. So what is this going to mean? I'm trying to think about either on a macro level, talking about the world in general, or if we're just talking about this in people's personal lives.
Well, so one positive way to work this, and I bet I'm preempting you, Kelly, because I think we're of one mind on this, with Venus-Uranus is, Uranus is like, let's stop doing the same fucking thing. This feels like a cage, right? And so just changing it up, if you've been Netflix and chilling, do something else, right? If you've been doing something else, have a night in, right? Just change it up. It's fresh air. Whatever, blowing through the heart chambers is kind of what this wants on the best way to work this generally on a personal level.
100%. I mean, that sort of old saying, a change is as good as a holiday, comes in because there's sort of this extreme, and holidays are a little off the board now, so we've got to think about how we can make those changes. But Venus-Uranus is this restlessness and this boredom, and suddenly feeling restricted by something that has previously felt quite comfortable or stable or even safe, we might say.
When is Thanksgiving in the US this year?
Oh, yeah. So this Venus-Uranus opposition is on Friday the 27th, and US Thanksgiving is Thursday the 26th.
That's hilarious. Ooh. Okay. Venus-Uranus opposition on the socially distanced Thanksgiving?
Yes.
Yeah, with a nice moon Mars in Aries.
Okay, nice.
I mean,
to ensure that the dinner conversation is ever so civil.
Sometimes when you see big Uranus aspects on, secular or religious holidays, you get this sense of like tradition with a twist or changing tradition. So sometimes, I think that's a bit of a for sure thing this year.
Yeah, Zoom Thanksgiving this year for everybody in the middle of a pandemic when the COVID numbers are like spiking up and nobody's traveling, but setting up their webcams at the dinner table in order to connect with family despite being super far apart.
Yes.
Yeah, and for some, it will be the novel pleasure of not having to see your family on Thanksgiving.
Exactly. Yeah, or the freedom that comes from not having to do the travel or the obligation duty side of, that type of celebration. And for, obviously we have listeners that aren't in the US and won't be celebrating, Thanksgiving. So I think that idea of shaking up routine that you were saying, Austin, and just doing things differently. Venus, if she's about pleasure, then how can you experiment with how you take your pleasure or what gives you that sense of kind of satisfaction or fulfillment, if you like? So definitely, whether it's a different food flavor or, you're playing a board game instead of watching TV, there's a variety of things you can do even within the space of your environment.
Yeah. All right. What else do we have going on this month in terms of the last few days? There's Neptune stationing direct around the same time on the 28th of November at 18 degrees of Pisces. Looks like the only thing it's making a hard aspect to is the nodal axis, which is at 19 degrees of Gemini and Sag. And that's a little bit relevant because then literally the very next day we get the lunar eclipse, which takes place in Gemini. It looks like on the 30th of November. At about 8 degrees of Sagittarius and 8 degrees of Gemini.
Yeah, that's kind of the last, November goes out with some fireworks.
With an ominous reddening of the moon, which will be visible throughout I believe the entire North American continent. It's not a total eclipse; it's a penumbral, but it's one of those. It'll be the ones where it looks like there's a stain on the moon,
yes.
right?
Mm.
Rather than the moon being completely gone.
And because look at this here in Denver, it looks like it's going exact. After 1 p.m. around or 1 a.m. to maybe 2 a.m. ish, it's going exact at 8 degrees of Gemini. So yeah, that will be visible in the night sky. And Mars setting over on the descendant around the same time.
And you'll be able to see bright red Aldebaran right next to the moon. It's an easy to see star. It's right on the ecliptic. Like that eclipse royal star conjunction will be something you can just eyeball, without any work.
Mm.
And that's actually a really great point for people who are trying to look at things, wait for a bright moon near something to have a look at it. I've been trying to kind of encapsulate how I think this full moon is going to feel or what, just on an individual level we might be experiencing. And some of the thoughts I had is, the idea of Rahu being this sort of hungry, this insatiable hunger, and the moon being in Gemini at the time of the eclipse. And this idea of almost being overstimulated or just craving more information, or I want to know what's going on. And so it feels a little bit like excessively head energy in terms of people maybe overthinking or some of that classic, insomnia that could go with full moons and or with eclipses. Did you guys have any thoughts on that? Just how you might describe it for people from that on the day vibe?
I think it's going to feel kind of manic.
Yeah, that's a great word.
Manic is funny. I was thinking of Gemini keyword I often use is like chatty. Gemini placements are very chatty.
Yes, I feel like social media might be buzzing.
Right. Yeah, a lot of like words and a lot of discussion and talk is suddenly like kicked up at that point.
Mm.
Well, and I think it's going to be a little crazy making.
That's the kind of vibe I'm getting. Yeah.
Yeah, like manic, crazy making, definitely verbal, right? It won't be a quiet couple days.
All right, so we get a loud lunar eclipse that sort of caps off the month. I actually have a nice little diagram here to share for eclipse season, which again was by Kyle at Archetypal Explorer, who is actually our sponsor this month. So check out archetypalexplorer.com. So this is just showing those two eclipses and how we enter into eclipse season with this lunar eclipse at the very end of November. And it tees up or cues the following and much more potentially important solar eclipse, which takes place on the 14th of December. So it's like entering into a important little portal where the luminaries start hitting new moons and full moons really close to each other, enough to cast shadows on the Earth.
Yes, the eclipse in December is a total solar eclipse because it's right in the middle of that eclipse season. So it's going to be quite a dramatic one.
Yeah, and also more importantly, it's falling in between some of those great outer planet conjunctions that are taking place. You know, the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction this month, but more importantly, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction next month, later in December.
Yes.
Yeah, there's quite a sequence in mid-December, right? Just over a couple days, we have the eclipse and then Saturn and Jupiter's movement and into Aquarius and conjunction. It's a lot of action.
It's kind of weird how that happens because we don't always have the astrology. It's like the astrology itself is also culminating here in November and December at the end of the year, and it just happens to line up pretty well with the calendar year. You know, we don't always have that. We don't normally have that on different years. It just so happens that some of the most striking and important alignments of the year happen to fall at the very end after a long sequence of different alignments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The natural calendar and the civil calendar are sort of in accord this year.
Definitely.
Yes.
All right. Well, that kind of brings us to, I believe, the end of November. Are there any other major planetary alignments or things that we meant to mention but have not gotten a chance to for some reason?
I think we've hit all the things.
We'll have to save the Saturn-Jupiter talk for next month when both Jupiter and Saturn finally get out of Capricorn and move into Aquarius, and then form their much discussed conjunction that's coming up right around the time of the winter solstice on the 21st of December.
Totally. And that's hugely significant for many reasons that we've all been talking about in various places, and we will touch on again in next month's show. But also just, it's just hitting me as you put that diagram up. Next month, Saturn will leave Capricorn after being there for 3 years. Like that cycle is in its dying weeks and days now. And I don't know about you all, but I'm happy to change that cycle. I'm not necessarily saying what's coming next is going to be perfect, but I feel like I've got a good Saturn in Capricorn dose for now, and I'm ready to close the door on that one.
Well, yeah, Kelly, what was the maxim that you mentioned earlier? Something about change is like a holiday?
A change is as good as a holiday?
Yeah, and I think that's a good argument for fresh hells. Like these right? Like this hell has grown quite stale. Like on to the next one, please.
Yes. Yeah, because at least there's a novelty component, and then it's like takes a while to discover and yeah.
Yeah, well, next year we're going to be talking a lot about the Saturn-Uranus square again, which we got a taste of in the late spring and early summer with some of the protests. But I don't think we really. I think that was just a little taste, and it'll be interesting to see what that's like when we get a full exact square of Saturn and Uranus next year.
Yes,
indeed, and the year after.
Yes.
Okay.
One of our listeners in the live chat, because we are recording with a live audience, Chris, you want to give us an auspicious election for the month?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's towards the end of the month anyway.
Yes.
Yes.
It is. Let me see if I have that. Let me animate the chart. So, our auspicious election this month, where each month Lisa Scheim and I pick out the most auspicious electional chart we can find for initiating different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. And this month, the electional chart that we picked was later in the month because we kind of wanted to get away from the Mercury retrograde, which is still, coming out of the Mercury retrograde at the beginning of the month. Mercury's still picking up steam and still starting to move forward again. And it's also getting that opposition from Uranus. We also wanted to wait until after Mars station direct. So again, that there's more forward movement. So what we ended up with was an electional chart set for November 28th, 2020 at about 12:30 p.m. with Pisces rising. So let me animate the chart really quickly so that you can see what that looks like. So moving it forward to the end of the month, November 28th, set your chart so that you have Pisces rising, and it will look something roughly like this. So this is a day chart with Pisces rising. The ruler of the ascendant is Jupiter, which is at 25 degrees of Capricorn in the 11th whole sign house. The moon in this chart is exalted in Taurus in the 3rd house, and it's applying a little bit widely, but still within 13 degrees to a trine with Jupiter. So that's the main thing we're featuring this month. And one of the things we talked about on the Auspicious Elections podcast, which we just recorded yesterday, and I'm going to release either later today or tomorrow, is just some months where things are not great for elections. You've really just got to, get down to the basics and focusing on dates when the moon is in decent shape, not being afflicted, and applying ideally through things like trines or maybe sextiles to the benefics. So this is capitalizing on the moon-Jupiter trine. It's making Jupiter the ruler of the ascendant. Jupiter also has a nice sextile from Mercury, which is at 25 degrees of Scorpio. Mars is in the 2nd whole sign house, so this is not a great chart for financial matters, but it is a relatively decent chart for 11th house matters having to do with friends and groups and social movements with the ruler of the ascendant in the 11th. It's applying to a conjunction with Saturn, but it's in a day chart, and there is reception between Jupiter and Saturn, so it's a much more manageable conjunction than it could be otherwise. One of the things we talked about on the podcast that we recorded yesterday for Auspicious Elections is just, those Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions have indicated sometimes the amassing of power and wealth, and sometimes that's gone majorly downwards for some people, but other people have been the opposite, have been tremendously successful and able to draw and attract more power and wealth to themselves this year, sometimes through luck and circumstances, and other times through like shrewd business investments. And, companies like Zoom, for example, which we've been using for several years to record these podcasts. But then all of a sudden this year with their lockdowns due to COVID, suddenly everybody's using Zoom and their stock prices have skyrocketed and their business has been booming. So sometimes certain people find themselves in those sorts of positions to sort of capitalize on bad situations or bad scenarios, even if things are going not super well for other people. This is, to some extent, a little bit of a chart like that. There are some problems financially, but in terms of 11th house matters, it's pretty decent. And basically just trying to take advantage or find a rising sign you can use when the moon is still applying to Jupiter. What other things, do you guys have any comments or any things that you would use this chart for if you're needing to start something in late November?
I mean, it's such slim pickings at the moment that the rules you're talking about, where it's like moon making a decent aspect to Jupiter, is kind of, you do that. I think we're actually recording under that now, the month prior. Right. We're looking at there's really not a lot of other aspects to choose from. So
is that what we did today? Here's the chart for now.
The moon's not in Taurus, but yeah, it's making an application to Jupiter by sextile.
Yeah, you're totally right. That's funny. So we picked the moon applying to sextile Jupiter with reception day for recording this podcast.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
The only other topic, like it's a 3rd house moon in that chart you were mentioning, Chris. So if, I'm thinking, that could be nice if I want to sit down and just slog away at some writing. If I want to, I don't know, chat to siblings about something maybe. you got to do the best. You can only work with what the sky's offering at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's the election for November. We found, I think, 3 or 4 other electional charts for November, which we put out in the Auspicious Elections podcast, which is available to patrons. I'll release that later today or tomorrow, like I said, so you can sign up through our page on patreon.com if you'd like to get access to that. Lisa and I are also going to start putting together our auspicious elections for 2021 soon. Some students of my electional astrology course have started turning in assignments where they're picking out electional charts for next year, and I'm starting to see some of those charts, and there's actually some really great elections coming up next year, especially in the spring and summer. So I'm excited about that because Jupiter's going to get out of Capricorn, and then it's going to zoom through Aquarius in the first few months of the year and make it into Pisces by like May or something like that, right?
Yeah, by mid-May.
Yeah, so there's some really nice Jupiter elections next year. So we will announce that probably on the next forecast episode as soon as it's ready. So that's the election for November. All right.
Excellent.
So I should mention our sponsor for this month, who I've already mentioned several times because he keeps producing really cool graphics for us. But I'm really enamored with his website, especially this year, because we've had so much outer planet action and so much mundane astrology going on. And we've been needing to look at some of these outer planet cycles, not just as singular hits, but in the context of, longer term planetary cycles that are, you have the ebb and flow of those applications and separations over the course of the year. So the website I've been using for most of these graphics is called Archetypal Explorer, which is available at archetypalexplorer.com. So the website can be used to study both natal as well as mundane astrology. It shows different monthly calendars and different things that you can look at to study direct and retrograde periods, transit timelines, solar activity, lunar activity natally. It also has some very nice different transit graphs that you can actually generate on your own. So most of the graphics that I've showed for like the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction or other things like that, you can actually generate for either mundane transits or your own natal chart through this website, choosing different orbs, choosing different aspects or date ranges, and then it'll sort of generate a graph for you for that transit. It also has some delineations that are derived from the work of Richard Tarnas and his book Cosmos and Psyche. They've got a special deal worked out with Tarnas to utilize those delineations, which is really helpful and really useful. I really like his interpretations. It's one of the better modern astrology texts. Let's see, transit calendars, different horoscope charts that you can generate for your birth chart and transits, and just a ton of different features. So one of the other things that's cool about this is that it's a subscription service. So unlike other astrology programs like SolarFire, which is the other program I use, with SolarFire, you have to pay several $100s up front, but this is something that you subscribe to each month, and you can get either monthly or yearly subscriptions for relatively cheap. So you don't have to just like pay everything up front. So they offer, once you sign up, a 1-month trial period or a 1-week trial period. So you can find out more information about that at archetypalexplorer.com. All right. And I think that concludes our forecast for November of 2020. Do we have any? I didn't think we expected to actually get through that and survive that in anything under like 3 hours. Did we ever line up any miscellaneous discussion topics, or do you guys have anything?
Now we're like crickets.
I mean,
I feel like we talked about
we
so
just
many
talked
things.
for 2.5 hours,
Yeah, we did it.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be a disappointing level of stuff.
Just one funny anecdote along the way. So I was talking about the Khabib Nurmagomedov's fight, and I've been looking forward to that for a long time. And big Mars retrograde in Aries moment, right? The avatar of that cycle. And here's the Mercury retrograde part. This is a Mars ruled Mercury retrograde. I didn't know what time the card was. Usually they start at 7 p.m. Pacific ish, and I went to check it that day. And because it took place, I think it was in Abu Dhabi. It took place at 11 a.m. On Saturday rather than 7 p.m. And so I got spoilered as soon as I went to check the time. So there was the Mercury retrograde piece on top of the Mars retrograde piece.
Nice.
And I was like, oh, well, and I was like, just pretend you didn't see that. Watch how it happened. I'm sure it's fascinating. So, I did the like, see no evil as soon as the spoilers popped up. In Kitten news,
Kitten
Sumo
Watch 2020
is Kitten Watch 2020. Sumo, is she around? We knew she was a large breed. She's a Maine Coon. Come on, sweetie. She's about as big as a small adult cat at 5 months old.
That's so insane.
We both feel a little robbed. We feel a little robbed of kitten time, tiny and adorable. She's still adorable, but but you're huge. Sweetie, is it okay if I pick you up? Let me see if she's right here.
Oh my God, it's so cute. I have the opposite. One of my cats, both my cats are 11, so they're more mature ladies, but one of them still looks like a kitten. She's just a little thing.
Wow, that is
Austin.
a gigantic kitten.
Yeah, 5 months old.
Yeah, and for those listening to the audio version, he's holding a cat the size of a small mountain lion right now.
You got to talk, Austin, so we can get like a larger version of you. Maybe I'll pin your video.
Yeah. Anyway, she's gigantic. And there's in terms of cat astrology, which, at another time I may have been more critical of, but having a timed chart for this cat and I have the same Mars. We both have Mars in early Pisces. And so Pisces ruleth the feet, and she literally hunts my feet. She doesn't do this with Kate's feet. She'll run from across the other side of the house to pounce on my foot.
Love it.
Like I'll be doing my mantras in the office, and literally she's like hunting and stalking and savaging my feet. And I was like, okay,
she's adorable.
I have in my chart the karma to have my feet attacked. You have foot attacking power planets, Kitten, and so we're a good match.
I love it. That's how she came to you. I mean, even her markings are just very, very attractive. Like she's just she's adorable.
Oh, she's got an angular Venus.
Oh, okay.
And if we want to do Kitten Jyotish, right, take it to the next level, her Venus is in Taurus and angular, and so she would have the powerful Venus Mahapurush yoga, meaning she's an avatar or a great being of Venus.
Wow.
And yes, she's fascinated.
Is that going to be your second book, cat astrology, after the Decans book?
Yeah. Maybe it'll be that. It'll actually just be the astrology of just my cat.
Right.
It'll be that self-involved.
That's the book that survives 2,000 years later. The Decans
that's
book
the one
long.
that people get. Oh my goodness.
Right. That goes on the Wikipedia.
I would love that. All right. Cat astrology, that should be a future episode. I did want to mention, I forgot to plug, Jessica Lanyadoo was just on, and she was promoting her Zodiac The Vote website, where she's trying to just encourage people, astrologers and astrology enthusiasts, to get out and vote in the US on November 3rd, or ideally before, if you want to avoid the Mercury retrograde stuff. So she's got some good voting guides and just different, like a Mercury retrograde survival guide for voting, which is actually pretty useful because it just gives you some information on getting registered or filling out ballots. Or one of the things I thought was actually useful is just things to remember when you go to vote, sometimes really basic stuff, but things that could be really important, like remember to bring an ID, because it would really suck if you went out and stood in line for 5 hours and got to it to vote and then got turned away for something simple or something stupid that was a Mercury retrograde type snafu. So you can find out more information about that on her website, which is zodiacthevote.com. And yeah, I definitely encourage everybody to get out and vote and sort of participate in the democracy in this election. I think is a good encouragement to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to becoming more knowledgeable about local politics now that I'm like in a place. Like, we just did apartments for 2 years here, did apartments for 2 years there for, I don't know, most of my adult life. And now that we're in a place, I'd really like to understand what's happening and, cast my ballot for what I would like to happen.
Yeah, well, it does make a difference, and especially locally. Like with locally, you can actually see individual politicians start from the very ground level, and over the course of a few years, you can watch them come up, and sometimes you can have a major impact on local elections. But I mean, that's also true nationally. Like some of the states, I think in the last election, were decided with a very small number of votes. So for the people that sometimes think that it doesn't matter, or your vote doesn't count, or what have you, I mean, some elections like Florida in 2000 came down to just a matter of like thousands of votes, which is really not that many people.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah.
And even if you're cynical about the national, like, even if you're cynical about the national, like, are you really cynical about like even your county? You think that like that's a much harder case to get super cynical about,
Right.
Yeah, it's the local politics is really interesting when you are like Austin. I think it's a great point. When you're anchored in a place for a while, then you can see more of a direct connection between who you vote for or voting and the democratic process and things that do or don't happen. Do you get speed humps down certain roads or speed limits and things like that? There's things like that really, can have an impact on your day to day, whether you may agree or disagree, but it's sort of makes it more real, or it helps you connect to the process when you can see a little bit more of a direct connection.
Yeah. Do you want to reelect the sheriff?
Yeah.
Right. These are real things.
Right.
Yeah. One thing in our local town where we live in Canada is, can you have chickens in your backyard? And chickens fall under the exotic animal rule there. So, it's come up petitions over the years.
Maybe if they're fancy.
No, they're just the way the local law or ordinance was written. So it's those kinds of things where, do we want to maybe change that? Is that law now 30 years old or what have you? So it's just really interesting.
Yeah, or even going back to the national level, like the appointment of Supreme Court justices, which is happening right now, and the people that say, well, it doesn't matter, or it'll just last for 4 years or 8 years, but then Supreme Court justice gets appointed, and then that's a lifetime appointment and has really tangible results on certain things. Like, a few years ago when we started doing the forecasts, we started it under a Venus-Jupiter conjunction, the three of us together. And I remember it was around that time that in the US, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, basically. So sometimes major things come out of elections through things like Supreme Court assignments. And that's one of the things that's actually happening right now.
Yeah. So I think when you start to connect those steps, you can see the larger impact that your single vote can contribute to, because the Supreme Court appointments in the US are lifetime appointments. So the younger somebody is when they get elected, the longer they will be there to potentially influence major laws.
Yeah, definitely. All right, guys.
Yeah.
What do you have coming up in November? Kelly, you've got a couple of events.
Yeah, I'm coming out of a bit of a quiet period. So I'm kicking off November 16. I start teaching a 4-part course on, I've got the details, you would just finalize this today. It's a 4-part training called Plot Your 2021 and Plan for the Year Ahead. So we're going to do some classes on timing with perfections and transit timing for next year. So it's kind of an intermediate level general interest course that starts on November 16. And on November 21st, I'm giving my last webinar for the year, which is called Aspects of Fortune and Favor with Venus and Jupiter. So we'll be looking at some of the nice aspects that Venus and Jupiter can make in the birth chart and what good stuff you can expect from them. So all the details about both of those will be on my website, kellysastrology.com. What about you guys?
That sounds great.
Very nice.
What do you have going on, Austin?
Oh, not much. I'm trying to finally getting done with 36 Phases 2.0. Just the finish line is in sight. Just gotta, finish it. I'm in that that last 10%, which will tend to expand. But I'm working on that. We'll be finishing up year 1 and year 2 in November. And then Sphere and Sundry has a series, which I elected, which will be coming out during the first half of the month. Very exciting, very powerful. I've been test driving it. Or it's been test driving me, would be what I would say. And there's another one, but that's not coming out until December. And, I have some classes that I taught last year, like my astrology and tarot class, that I never put up for sale. I taught the class, we did it, and I had them beautifully, what's the word? Sound
recorded?
Shaved.
Yeah.
Sanded down, edited, made nice
polished.
To listen to.
Yeah.
And they've just been sitting around. 2020 has been so distracting. It's felt like there's never been a good moment to do anything. Maybe I'll get those up for sale. I got a couple lectures I gave last year that I also have recordings of, but just aren't up for sale. So maybe if I get done with Faces, I'll move on to the Mercury retrograde pile of things which have been delayed.
Yeah. Excellent.
That sounds good. And what's your website again?
Oh, AustinCoppock.com.
Brilliant. All right. People should check that out. As for myself, I mainly am going to be focusing on the podcast. I've got a bunch of major episodes I've been putting off, but preparing, that I've scheduled for November. And I don't want to announce the topics yet, but I think it should be a really good month and a really important month on the podcast. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it and doing some of those interviews next month. The only thing I want to plug is over the past year, we started doing advertising, but also we started doing a sponsor card at the end of each episode. And I just wanted to let people know about that because it's been kind of a nice thing, allowing us to buy some more technical equipment. And we're trying to upgrade Kelly and Austin's video, which actually I think by the end of the year we should have probably accomplished. But if you would like to sign up for our page on patreon.com/astrologypodcast, we have the producer tier where you can get your name listed at the end of each episode that is produced each month. So here's our list of current patron sponsors, which are Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Bear River, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, and of course our friend Sumo Coppock. So if you would like
That's brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Sumo is one clever cat.
Sumo, thank you to Sumo
she's
and
an
Caitlin
investor.
Coppock.
She's an investor.
It's a wise strategy move to advertise and have your name listed, name recognition for Sumo and other astrology cats. So if you'd like to have your name listed at the end of each episode of the Astrology Podcast, you can find out more information about that at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. I just wanted to thank all the patrons for supporting our work here this year because it's made it possible to keep producing episodes each month and to get to episode, what are we at again, Kelly? 277?
77, my show notes tell me, which you wrote. I just have them printed in front of me.
So then that means that we're gonna hit episode 300 in the coming year. We have passed 50,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is kind of crazy this past month. And we're on our way to 100,000 potentially sometime in the next year. So the podcast is going to keep growing, keep expanding, and keep producing new episodes next month and into next year. So thanks to all the patrons for joining us. Thanks to everybody. There's about 200 patrons who showed up for the live recording today. So thanks everyone for your comments and everything in the live chat. We appreciate it. And it makes this a lot more fun and sort of interactive as we're doing these episodes. And thanks Austin and Kelly for joining me today.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching this episode of the Astrology Podcast. Good luck in November, and we'll see you again next month for the forecast for December. So good luck and take care.
Yeah. Good afternoon and good luck.
Special thanks to the patrons who support the Astrology Podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons that are on our producers tier, such as Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Bear River, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, and Sumo Coppock. Find out more about how to become a patron at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, thanks to our sponsors this month, which include the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and also the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting an astrology conference August 18th through the 22nd, 2021. Find out more information at isar2020.org. As well as the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening May 27th through the 31st, 2021, and you can find out more information about that at norwac.net. Finally, the software we use here on the Astrology Podcast is called SolarFire Astrology Software, and it's available through alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.